Mile Road family and friends that are joining us online, may the grace and peace of God be abundantly yours in these days. I am so excited that today we are starting a brand new sermon series looking through the biblical book of 1 Peter. And as we go through this letter in the Bible over the next coming weeks, we hope so much for you to get as much out of it as you possibly can. And so we want to encourage you to engage and interact with this letter in various ways, even outside of Sunday mornings. So, for example, our GCMs, those are our smaller communities, will be working through this letter. And some of you have begun already this week. And just so that you know, if you're joining us online from our region and are not yourself connected to a local church, we'd love to connect you to one of our smaller communities, to people in your area, so that you can process God's Word with some other folks. We also want you to know one of the hopes we have throughout these coming weeks is to take some opportunities to dig deeper in some of the topics that 1 Peter will surface. So, for example, evangelism, or how we relate to our government, or marriage. These are all things that will come up in the letter, and we hope to create spaces and opportunities for you to engage those topics and go deeper. And so, if we're able to make that happen, avail yourself to those opportunities and those resources. We've also tried to provide many of you with a journal version of 1 Peter so that you can have a copy that you can take notes and engage with and read on your own and jot down the things that God is showing you. But in various ways, take every opportunity to interact with this letter, to read it, to digest it, to let God speak to you through it. And as you do, I think that you will find in God's providence, this is a perfectly timed and relevant word from God for us. So today we want to get started in this letter by just looking at the first two verses. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Katie read them for us, but would you just hear them again? Here's God's word. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and for sprinkling with His blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. Those are the first two verses of the letter, and right from the first verse, the first bit of information we get is who this letter is from and who this letter is to. Right in verse 1, we get who the letter is from and who the letter is to. So we're told in the opening words who this letter is from. It's from Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's who this letter is from. Now, before we go on from there, would you slow down with me for a second and just take that in? This is a letter from Peter. Consider that. Just this week, out of the blue, totally random, I got a text from my mom, and in it was a picture of a Christmas card from my uncle. What made that picture especially special was that this card was sent back in 1986. My uncle, my mom's brother, passed away that very Christmas. And so before he passed, this is the last thing that he had sent to us. You can imagine, 35 years later, this card was perfect and pristine, carefully kept, because for my mom, this letter was precious to her. Consider, brothers and sisters in Christ, the Church of Jesus has a letter from Peter. The Peter who saw Jesus with his own eyes, touched him with his hands, heard him with his ears, who walked next to him, traveled with him, ate next to him, ministered with him, who spent 3 years of life with Jesus. That Peter, the Peter who witnessed Jesus perform miracles, who heard Jesus teach and preach the Sermon on the Mount, the Peter who was there when Jesus got arrested, who denied Jesus 3 times and saw Jesus look at him. The Peter who had eyewitnessed his sufferings, been visited by the resurrected Jesus in flesh, who had that conversation with Jesus on the beach, where 3 times Jesus tenderly asked Peter, "Do you love me, Peter? Do you love me more than these?" And 3 times, almost to match the 3 denials and betrayals, he hears Jesus say to him, "Feed my sheep. Tend to my lambs." Which, by the way, is exactly what 1 Peter is doing. Peter is doing what Jesus told him to do, feeding the flock of God with spiritual food. That Peter, who saw Jesus, who was an eyewitness of his death and resurrection, has written this letter that we have, and oh, how precious it is to us. And by the way, it's because of that he was there to see Jesus and was an eyewitness of his death and his resurrection, that he can write in the opening words, not only from Peter, but add the words, "an apostle of Jesus Christ." This is not just Peter. This is Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Apostle, capital A apostle, meaning someone who was chosen personally by Jesus Christ, as Peter had been, and who was an eyewitness of Jesus Christ's resurrection, as Peter was. In fact, you'll see when you get to chapter 5 that he'll write, "I exhort you as an eyewitness of the sufferings of Christ." You know, Peter in chapter 1 will say to us who read his letter, "You've not seen Jesus, but you love him. You don't see him now, but you believe in him." That's wonderful. But Peter's in a different category. He had been an eyewitness of Jesus Christ. That's why there are no more capital A apostles anymore, because there's no one left who has been personally chosen by Christ and was a witness to the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so therefore, Peter's words as an apostle of Jesus Christ, as someone chosen by Christ, authorized to represent Christ and speak on Christ's behalf, carries a weight and an authority that no other source for us does. Peter's letter, tucked into the Scriptures, bear an authority over us. It's the way that one theologian and former pastor named John Piper said. He basically called this our new Constitution. Think of that for a second. Living in the precise moment we are in American history, in the political world all around us, and the things that are going on around us, the Constitution of the United States is being endlessly referenced. Constantly, the Constitution is being brought up. And when you consider how it's being used in conversation, it's being closely read and carefully considered. The intentions of its authors are being studied and thought about, and how it applies. Because why? In this precise moment in U.S. history, the Constitution, as it has always done, provides a framework for how our government can operate, what's permissible and what's not, what's in bounds, what's out of bounds. It gives guidance on how we should proceed. In that same way, consider the Scriptures, 1 Peter being a part of them, for a Christian. In a sermon that John Piper preached back in 1993, and yet all these decades later, its words ever as relevant. He says of this passage, "This is your new Constitution. This is authority." To put it very simply, Christians are aliens, and that implies that we have a new constitution, namely the Bible. This is our Constitution. And because that's the case, he goes on to say we are aliens in America because we put it like that. Consider, we read the Scriptures, pore over it, consider the author's intentions and its applications and how it bears on us, because this is our Constitution. It's like if you're a citizen of Romania or a citizen of Peru, you might read the U.S. Constitution. There might be certain parts that intrigue you, certain parts that you find particular or peculiar, certain parts you might find outdated or irrelevant. And at the end of the day, you as a citizen of Romania can shelve the U.S. Constitution. But not so a citizen of the United States. A citizen of the United States is subject to the Constitution, bound to its authority. And Peter, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, his words are our constitution. We who are followers of Jesus are subject to its authority, bound to its words. As you read 1 Peter today and in the coming weeks, if you follow Jesus Christ, hear it that way. But in verse 1, we're not only told who this letter is from, we're also told who this letter is to. The text says, "To those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." To those who are elect exiles. Exiles. Friends, as you read through the 5 chapters of 1 Peter, you will find that this is the dominant descriptor that the Apostle Peter uses throughout the letter to speak of the followers of Jesus Christ. He'll use all kinds of metaphors. He'll call us the temple. He'll call us a royal priesthood. He'll call us sheep and a flock. But out of all of them, the most dominant metaphor he uses is that we are exiles. Other translations, we're strangers. We're aliens. We're foreigners. That a Christian, no matter what country you were born in, no matter what country you reside in, no matter where your passport is stamped, a Christian is never quite fully at home, no matter where on the earth he finds himself or she finds herself residing. A Christian is never fully home because core to our identity, central to who we are, Peter says, we are exiles. I can tell you, as the son of an immigrant, I know that really well, and many people at 7 Mile Road would understand that experience. I can tell you, for example, I was born and raised in America, and yet, like lots of minorities would tell you, I have never found America to be perfectly home. Felt like I've totally fit in. Every immigrant will tell you, at some point you're going to be asked the question of, where are you from? And you'll answer that question with, I'm from New York. No, where are you really from? I'm from Long Island, New York. No, where are you really from? Why? Because at some point there's something about you that feels foreign. And growing up in that way, you never feel fully at home. I remember when 9/11 happened, and you remember the hysteria and panic of all of society at that moment. I remember walking out of my college dorm, and while I was, someone shouted out from the window, I had no idea who they were, "Go back to your own country." And you can imagine, as any immigrant would tell you, that was jarring because I had been born here. I was home. And yet you know the sense of never feeling fully at home. So you'd imagine then the recipe was when I go to my ancestral home, my parents' home of India, then I'll finally feel fully at home. But I can tell you, as an Indian American, every trip to India has exposed I'm not fully at home there either. I remember this one time, being in the village of my parents and going to the sort of street shop that sold lemonade. And I went with a friend to buy lemonade. And can I tell you, I wore the outfit exactly like all my relatives did, spoke the language perfectly. I have a mastery of the Indian language, not in this Americanized accent. I spoke it perfectly. And I ordered my lemonade in perfect Malayalam, the language of my parents. Wearing the outfit, dressed the part, I said, "Can I have 2 lemonades?" While the gentleman was making it, he turned to me and said, "Where are you from?" And I couldn't believe it. I was thinking to myself, not here also. I get the question back in America, but you're asking me where am I from? And I said, "Here, what do you mean?" He goes, no, where are you really from? And I had to sheepishly confess, I live in the United States. And he said, "I knew it." And I said, how did you know? Because my language was perfect, the dress was perfect. How did you know? And he finally said, "It's the way you sweat. You see, we can tell you're not used to this climate. And by your sweat, we can tell you're not from here." You can imagine. My accent didn't give it away. My clothes didn't give it away. My mannerism didn't give it away. My sweat finally did. The point was, neither here nor there do I ever feel perfectly at home. In fact, I've learned a term for people like me. It's called third culture. You sort of don't fit here, you don't fit there. And in that place, you feel sort of homeless. Well, as disorienting as that might be, I've actually found it's a perfect advantage to get a sense of what Peter is saying is the experience of all Christians. All Christians have a sense of homelessness, like they don't perfectly fit anywhere. You consider that. No matter where your passport is stamped, no matter what country you were born or reside in, we who are Christians, our constitution is the Scriptures. Our King is Jesus. Our citizenship is in heaven. We are ambassadors of God, working out of local embassies of the outposts of heaven called the local church, appealing to the world to be reconciled to our God. We're exiles. Peter says that is core to who we are, central to our identity. And consider this, brothers and sisters. Aren't Peter's words and his insistence that we understand ourselves to be exiles as central and core to our identity, isn't that a word that we as Christians in America particularly need to hear? It's been said by now dozens of times, repeated over and over again, that amidst all the things that made last week's events at the U.S. Capitol troubling, as a follower of Jesus Christ, what made it especially troubling was to see almost how enmeshed Christianity was with what we saw unfold at the Capitol. You've seen by now pictures, read the articles of how crosses could be visible in the mob, how flags with Jesus' name on it, how prayers would be offered before mobs stormed the Capitol. And Peter would have no understanding of an enmeshment between national identity and Christian identity as though they're one and the same. I read a book this past week called A Creative Minority by a man named John Tyson. It was written in 2016, 5 years ago, and yet its words, as you hear them, feel almost eerily prophetic. Listen to what the author says as he speaks of sort of Christians in America feeling like we're displaced from society and sort of pushed out from center and losing power and being marginalized. And listen to what he says. He says, society both senses and fears a Christian backlash to our loss of influence, worrying that this backlash will come out in negative or violent ways. The further out of the public square we are pushed, the angrier and more frantic our rhetoric becomes. It's as though, out of a fear of being forgotten, we seek to span our growing distance from the center with volume and intensity rather than engaging with intimacy. But if we are not careful, we will be seen as not as bearers of good news, but rather as ideological warriors seeking to force a Christian theocracy on a resistant nation. I don't know about you, but I found those words eerily prophetic, scripted 5 years ago, and yet seeming to be every bit as relevant to the week and a half we're living in. And here's the thing. Peter wrote to Christians who found themselves the minority, marginalized throughout the Roman Empire, scattered everywhere, and they had no political power. They had no political pull. They were mistreated and misunderstood and slandered and reviled and discriminated and insulted. Throughout, you'll find that throughout the Roman Empire, their practices and their beliefs were seen as odd and peculiar and strange to the culture around them. When Peter is writing this letter, the Emperor Nero is on the throne. And if you know that name, you know that soon enough after this letter has been written, Christians will be fed to lions. There will be an official state-sponsored persecution against Christians. Peter is well aware that Christians will be marginalized, mistreated, suffer. In fact, friend, read these 5 chapters and you will see that suffering is a dominant theme throughout this book. All throughout, you can't miss it. You read chapter 1, and Peter will speak of us being grieved by various trials as though we're going through a fire, it'll feel like. Read chapter 2, and he'll speak of Christians who will suffer unjustly, suffer even though we do good. Read chapter 3, and Peter will tell us of Christians who will be reviled and slandered and suffer for righteousness' sake. Read chapter 4, and he'll speak of Christians who are maligned for not doing the things that the world does, seen as peculiar and ostracized for not participating in the world's ways and values. Read chapter 5, and he'll try to encourage Christians that your suffering is for a little while, and then glory is going to come. Suffering is all throughout this letter. Peter is well acquainted with it, and he wants to give these suffering exiles hope. And so, with all these places of suffering, he'll also say, your suffering has accomplished something. It's patterned after Jesus' suffering. It speaks to the glory of God. It'll witness to a world that Jesus is worth suffering for. It'll win people to Christ. Your suffering has purpose in the plans of God. It's not meaningless. So hang in there, Peter will say. But amidst all of this, even though he knows that as exiles the people of God will suffer, at no point does Peter suggest that we take up the sword. For after all, Peter had done that in the garden, and Jesus told him to put it away. And at no point is Peter's strategy to exiles for us to try and control the world, or for us to abandon the world, or to assimilate into the world. Peter's solution for exiles, for Christians who find themselves a bit homeless, aliens and strangers, no matter what part of the world they live in, is not to try and control this world by force, nor abandon it and leave it to go to hell because we'll go off to heaven, nor to assimilate in such a way that you can't tell the difference between us and the world. So then what's Peter's strategy for Christians, for followers of Jesus? Exiles. Core to who we are, central to our identity is that we are exiles. And you know what it is about exiles, about strangers, about aliens, about foreigners? They always stand out. They always stick out. They're always different. They're always distinct. You can always tell a foreigner. That's why he's called a foreigner. He doesn't perfectly fit. She doesn't perfectly assimilate. She stands out. And as you consider that's central to who we're supposed to be as Christians, let me give us a word of warning and a word of encouragement. I read an article by a man named Ben Sixsmith. He professes in the article that he's not a Christian. He wrote an article as he noticed some of the trends of Christianity in America. And he said that what the church seems to often do is offer sort of a twist of Christianity. He calls the trend with a twist of Christianity. He says you can go to sort of the right-leaning end of society, and there you'll find business-oriented evangelicals who offer capitalistic self-enrichment, extreme patriotism with a twist of Christianity. He says you can go to the left-leaning edge of society, and you'll find that they'll promote all the usual left-leaning causes with a twist of Christianity. He basically says one will let you keep your money and have God, one will let you do what you want with your body and have God, with a twist of Christianity. Christianity is essentially an add-on to all the other things you already value. And then listen to what Mr. Sixsmith says. Hear this quote. So if Christianity is such an inessential add-on, why become a Christian? I am not religious, so it's not my place to dictate to Christians what they should and should not believe. Still, if someone has a faith worth following, I feel that their beliefs should make me feel uncomfortable for not doing so. If they share 90% of my lifestyle and values, then there is nothing especially inspiring about them. Instead of making me want to become like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me. Hear that word, 7 Mile Road. And he's not speaking of other Christians there. He's speaking to us. We are Christians in America. And he's saying to us that we ought to evaluate that our trend is so desperately to be liked that there's often nothing distinctive about us. That there's nothing that if you hid our name on social media that would suggest that our comments are any different than the world around us. That we practice the same tactics, operate in the same ways, value the same things in such a way that he would say as a non-Christian watching us, it's often not so much that we want him to become like us, but we're desperately trying to become more and more like him. It's a word of warning to us to consider, to confess, to repent of. And Peter's call for Christians is that we remember we're exiles. We're nonconformists in that way. And we are to stand different than the prevailing culture around us so that we can't be pigeoned perfectly on this side or this side. We're something other. I'll give you an example of what that could look like. In this same book, Creative Minority, that I mentioned before, he speaks of the celloist of Sarajevo. You see, in 1992, in May of that year, one of the lead musicians of the Sarajevo Opera, dressed in formal attire, and he sat down on a fire-scorched chair in a bombed-out crater and began to play his cello. You see, it was 1992, it was the siege of Sarajevo, and during that siege, tens of thousands of people lost their life. And he was sitting in a bombed-out crater outside of a bakery where 22 people were waiting in line for bread and were instantly killed. During that conflict, there were years where there were bombs and shelling of the city, snipers all about. But this celloist's response to all the ugliness that he saw around him was to seek to fill the air with the beauty of his music. And so for 22 days, one day for each person that had been killed in that bombing, he began to play. He played amidst bombs blasting. He played amidst snipers shooting. His quote was, "My weapon was my cello." And there he was, out in the open, completely vulnerable. And the residents of that city began to say that his music created an oasis and provided hope amid the horror. Eventually, one reporter came and asked him if he was crazy for playing in the middle of a war zone. And it's said that this musician simply smiled and asked back, "Why do you not ask if they are crazy for bombing Sarajevo?" Peter's call to followers of Jesus is that we are to live in the midst of a world that seems to be falling apart all around us and play the music of the gospel and sing the songs of a different place and a different king under a different constitution, living different and distinct lives. So much so that in chapter 3 he says that when they come to revile you and ask if you're crazy, your life might turn around. Perhaps the world has gone crazy. You see, that's our call. And here's the thing that Peter also wants to say, and then we'll be done. What makes us distinct is not our determination to become distinct. It doesn't start with what we do for God. What makes us distinct starts with what God has done for us and who He's made us by what He's done for us. Do you notice in the verse? This letter from Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, is not just to exiles. No, it's to elect exiles. Elect exiles, who goes on to say, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with His blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. They're not just exiles, they're elect exiles. That is to say that this marginalized, powerless, suffering minority of people have been from before the foundation of the world elect by God. And God's election, God's choosing of His people, is what has made them foreign, what has made them strangers, aliens. He's taken them out of the kingdom of darkness and transferred them into the kingdom of light. And by his election, they become strange and peculiar. You see, this world may have no regard for them, but this verse says God has regarded them from before the foundation of the world. They may not be at home anywhere on this earth, but they have eternally been at home with God. For the Father foreknew them, and the Spirit has sanctified them for obedience to the Son and the sprinkling with his blood. From before the foundation of the world, they have eternally been objects of his grace, recipients of his mercy, in view of his saving grace. And so no matter how marginalized they are, no matter what a minority they are, no matter what they suffer, Peter wants to infuse these suffering exiles with hope because of who they are, because of what God has done, because of his gracious, sovereign will to elect them and save them. And so over this marginalized, suffering, mistreated, peripheral people, Peter pronounces this blessing. May the grace and peace of God be multiplied, that is, be abundantly yours. Here, suffering Christian, suffering exile, no matter how marginalized you are, the grace, that is the favor of God, and the peace, that is the shalom of God, the comprehensive well-being of everything of God, be abundantly yours through Jesus Christ. Peter intends for this to give them hope and us as well. So you consider brothers and sisters in Christ all around the world who take Peter's letter in their hands. To the South Asian brother who's sitting reading reports of the government's passing anti-conversion laws and threatening jail and persecution, what a comfort to read Peter say, no matter how marginalized you become or mistreated, you have eternally been in God's heart, on God's mind, in God's view. The Father foreknew you. The Son sprinkled his blood to make you his. The Spirit sanctifies you. To our brother or sister in China who gathers with the church underground, who walks home different routes so as to not be followed and lead officials to the gathering of Christians, what a comfort to read. Your suffering has purpose. It's patterned after Christ. It will win the world over to you. Keep going. You are the elect of God. The triune God himself has been involved in your salvation. Or to the Christian brother or sister in America who knows right now that our call is not to try and control the world around us, nor to abandon the world around us, nor to acquiesce to the world around us and assimilate to the world around us. But rather, our call is to remain a distinct but engaged group of exiles who know that this is not ultimately our home, but who give off the music of the gospel while we are here, waiting for glory. So then we are suffering as exiles, but hopeful exiles nonetheless.